A brand is just something that signifies who made it, who stands behind it. That's what a brand is. What I talk about is brand equity and what a brand is worth. Brand equity is three things. It's not awareness anymore, it's brand relevance. And second, it's brand image, but maybe an expanded view of what we think of image. And three, it includes brand loyalty as well. The idea of brand relevance is it's not enough to be visible. I mean, Pepsi-Cola is visible, but nobody would go to Pepsi-Cola to buy a compact car. So you have
Yeah.
to be visible in the right setting, the right context, and you have to be credible. So you have to be credible that you can make say, a hybrid compact. And if you are credible and you decide to start to make electric cars, you have to do it all over again. You have to be credible in that space. You have to be visible in that space. The second is image, and it's more than functional benefits. It involves social benefits, self-expressive benefits, emotional benefits. It involves a connection, a relationship you have that can be based on respect and admiration and even inspiration, as well as a transactional, functional thing. But the third thing is the most important for branding, and that involves brand loyalty. So the value of your brand is really based in most cases on the size and intensity of the loyalty of your customer base. That gets branding into when it first emerged in the early 1990s. It really changed everything because brand loyalty puts you in charge of the whole customer journey. It gets you involved in R&D. What are you going to vet? It gets you involved in customer insights and segmentation. It becomes a C-suite activity. In the 1990s, we had chief marketing officers and we had VPs of marketing that now we're at the executive table. They're not just delegated to interacting with an agency who would do all the heavy lifting.
Hey, David Aaker just shared the five B's, but I want to reiterate here. The first one is brand equity, and it's important because that's really brand value. How much value does your brand have over something that doesn't have a brand? So take, for example, a t-shirt, and if you slap a Nike logo on it, how much more are you able to charge for it? I mean, turns out Nike's brand value is upwards of $30 billion. So you have to view brand as value, as an equity, as an asset, not just, logos, colors, and color palettes. The next one is about brand relevance. Brand relevance is really about making sure that whatever you're offering, whatever you're showing is exactly what your customers, their target customers care about. It's relevant to their problems, to their identity. The next is brand loyalty. Loyalty is about keeping people within the experience, within the brand. In today's world, it's really expensive, obviously, to get a cold audience to become a warm one to buy you. And then once they're in there, how do you put together an experience? How do you keep people in there? And part of it is about increasing the level, the status of your customers within your world. The next is brand image. That's really outward, on the outward side. How are you showing up? Whether it's imagery, whether it's visual, verbal, experiential, right? So what are all the things you're putting together to have that image that attracts your target audience? And then the last one is brand portfolio. So think about your growing business, not just as one singular thing, but what are the other components you add to increase associations with it? Whether you're developing a new technology, a new framework, a new methodology, you start to increase the different sort of sub brands within your ecosystems or new brands within that to increase the number of touch points and increase the number of things that people can latch onto. Okay, now David's going to share with us some really awesome examples to help bring some of this to life.
David, when we think about the equity of any brand, the equity of a company, a product, or service, how does it actually influence the behaviors of people? Is this something that's embedded within us as humans?
It comes down to the buying decision and the use experience. Both are influenced by brand. And so you think of the brand experience as something logical and rational and so forth. And there are people that argue that brands don't matter as much anymore because now people have Google and they have AI and they can learn all about the brand and all its specifications and so on.
Hmm.
The reality is that when it comes to a decision, even if you're deciding what airline manufacturer to use, or if you're deciding what surgical equipment to buy, or if you're deciding what kind of yogurt you want. Uh, the reality is that people rarely have the motivation, or the time to actually do research.
Mhm.
And it's also true even when they do that research, whether it's airplanes or automobiles or yogurt, they, at the end of the day, they're kinda overwhelmed with data and analysis, and they go with their instinct.
Yeah.
Brand,
Yeah.
do you trust this brand? Is it gonna do what it says? Does it deliver? And then when it comes to use experience, your use experience really not only is something that defines how you think of the brand, it's affected by what you think of the brand. So if you think the brand is fun to drive, it's gonna be fun to drive. I mean, if you don't think it's fun to drive, it's never gonna come to your mind. And so if
Right.
you have the ultimate driving machine under you, then you're more likely to enjoy the fun, you're gonna enjoy the moment. And if you don't have that image and relationship with your car, you won't. So it's gonna affect the use experience also.
David, I had a really interesting conversation with a neuroscientist, and one of the things that she said, so this is Dr. Bryn Weingart, she said that especially in high stakes decision making, the human brain actually defaults more to instinct and emotional feeling than logical, rational reasoning, which was such a big mind flip for me because I always feel like, oh, if you're in a high stakes situation, if you're a surgeon, if you're in the Navy SEALs, you're making very logical decisions. It's actually flipped, actually the other way. So I think what you're saying is that we have to be mindful of the experience, of the emotions of the people we're trying to influence, and branding and brand equity can totally help to move that along.
That's really fascinating, and I would love to get her endorsed, but it doesn't surprise me.
We were talking about Minnesota, David, just before we hit the record button. And you and your family spend summers in Minnesota. And I believe this past summer you were at Fair Hills Resort in Detroit Lakes. It seems like a really fun time. And I understand the lake culture here, being here for a long time as well. Now, David, when you think about Minnesota as a brand, how do you describe the brand of Minnesota?
Well, Minnesota Nice is such a great tagline. Las Vegas, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. It 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 really, I think Minnesota Nice might be one of the, more powerful and effective descriptors that people can use. It really frames a discussion, doesn't it? Would you like to go to some place where people ignore you, or some place where people are so frenetic that you have to stay up at 3 in the morning to be part of the team? Minnesota Nice is really powerful. The other thing I talk about is visual symbols, and I have a really close friend that was a congressman here, David Mingy, and a bicycle is his symbol because he would bicycle around his congressional district in the summers in Minnesota and meet his constituents there. The bicycle had a lot of positive elements to it. It was concerned with the parks and the trails. It was being active and out there, being connected to your constituents. So there's another Minnesota symbol that at one time worked well.
David, one of the reasons I brought this up, it's also pretty timely, being a Minnesotan resident, seeing your state in the headlines, especially when it's not good headlines, it speaks to the era, that we are in today. And you talk about this in your latest book, Acker and Branding, the second edition, about the hostile communication environment. Do you think Minnesota's brand is tarnished?
Every time that happens to people, I get curious about what to do about it, and you have to argue back. That's true, but you want to do as little of that as possible. It's nice to
Mm.
have just a nice, crisp, clean thing. Like, here's one fact, and here's another fact. Let's go. Let's move on. Because the more you argue about it, the more visible it is. And there's so many people that will not listen to, they won't listen to the content of your argument, they will just recognize there's an argument. And if there's an argument, that means that there's some people that believe there's a problem, and that's kind of what they're left with. A good example is Audi. They had a sudden acceleration problem that was where they were accused of having defective engineering, and they proved that wasn't the case. It was driver error, and they kept arguing back, saying, "No, we're not at fault." And they couldn't sell Audis for 15 years in this country. It just never left them. What I like to do is just to try as best you can is to ignore it and not to make it visible. Again, if you have to argue back, if it's in a place where it's a rampant mistruth, you know, you very crisply and definitely say, this is true, and it's ridiculous. We're going to move on. And then what's really important is to change the conversation. And if you can change it back to Minnesota nice, maybe you can make it newsworthy. Maybe there can be a series of stories that are emotional and reflect Minnesota nice. Walmart had a problem where they had a terrible reputation because of the way they presumably treated employees, the way they used their suppliers were people that used underage labor, and they were bad on their communities. It was really awful, to the point where a sizable percentage of America would not shop at Walmart. And then 7 years ago, CEO was on a camping trip with a friend who was an environmentalist who challenged him to do something. And, after a year and a half of research and experimenting there, and they, started this environmental program where they changed the trucks, they changed their lighting, they did all kinds of things. They made a huge difference in terms of environmental measures, huge difference. And there was an article soon after that said it's hard to hate Walmart anymore. They didn't change the conversation, but at least they provided an alternative conversation. And my advice to Minnesota would be the same.
Yeah. Well, it just brings up as you talk about, if you continue in the argument, you're gonna keep having these arguments be in the media. So instead of that, like you said, pivot to maybe it's stories about taking in these refugees. You know, we are nice. We take in Hmong population. We take in Somalians. We take in people that are desperate. We take in people that are, that's looking for achievement and to be successful. And I think focusing on those stories is important.
One or two signature stories about people that have really contributed in that from that community and frame the discussion that way. There's probably the most influential book that I've read is one by a linguist at the University of Berkeley, George Lakoff. And he wrote a book, Is There an Elephant in the Room? He wrote several actually,
Mm,
but his point was it's not who has the best argument that wins.
mm,
It's the one that chooses what the argument is about. So is the argument about the scandal that came out of this community, or is the argument about this community that's done as deliverance? You can make the argument about that, then you win. And if the argument's about this scandal, and we're saying, oh, the scandal is not as big as you think, and the scandal's over with, then you've lost.
right.
Um,
Right. Reframing it is an important strategy. When when humans make decisions and even the experience of our lives, we talk about Minnesota and thinking back to the past, like the meaning that we place on things are the stories that we tell ourselves and not actual logical fact, right? It's not the truth. We're not interested in the truth as humans. This is the stories that we tell, the experiences, the things that we say to ourselves. And that's, I feel, where branding is really powerful if done right. Like you said, if done right, if everything's aligned. But if you say one thing but your experience is another, it actually hurts the trust and credibility of your product or company.
yes, that's true for sure. Yeah, you can't promise anything you can't deliver. And it's not only a matter of delivering it, it's being credible. It's having people believe you can deliver on it.
David, you talked about signature stories a lot. What are some steps? So how can a company or even an entrepreneur, a solopreneur, a founder get to their signature story? And is there one story? Are there multiple stories? Help us think about how signature stories work.
Yeah, of course, I wrote that book called Creating Signature Stories, in which I do that. I think that people recognize in this day of information overload and skeptical audiences and media clutter and polarized audiences, it's really hard to break through. And one of the ways you break through is you distract from counter arguing. You get people so involved in the message that they don't then they get the strategic message indirectly, and it's like, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. So if you entertain them with something that's really funny, or if you, amaze them, that's something that's sort of off the wall, the GoPro is jumping out of airplanes or something, and if you can captivate them with a story, it might be an emotional story or humorous story, and the message is either embedded in there or it's motivated by the story. Then you can gain their attention and they won't turn you off. They won't be skeptical and so forth. I remember there was a time in America a long time ago now in which there was um, the oil in the Middle East was kind of turned off and there was lines at the gas stations and people remembered they hated the gas companies, Chevron and so forth. They just hated them. They thought they were making 40 cents on the dollar because, that's where the excess prices were going, and they were making these lines so they could charge more. And, and they tried all kinds of logic. They explained, "We only make 3 cents on the dollar, not 40." And they would and then they put out some ads with dinosaur really colorful, playful, humorous dinosaur cartoon characters that explain that, "We're around and we made oil, now we're not around anymore, and you gotta be concert." And the attitude toward them softened a lot. And, so if it and they told this story of the how o oil comes around and why it's only a finite amount, and, uh, and they did it in such a humorous storytelling way that people accepted it. My favorite, story is that of a appliance company in China, which in now late '80s 1980s was going out of business. They were making trash and they got a middle manager to take over the company and see if he could save it. And a customer went in with a defective appliance and he went to the warehouse. 40% of them were defective. He took those appliances to the shop floor and they destroyed them with a sledgehammer. And then he said, from now on, we're going to build quality things and no other. And that sledgehammer is now in a company museum. The story is never told by the company, but everybody knows about it. All the employees, all the retail clerks that sell their stuff, and that company now is the largest selling appliance company in the world. It's higher,
Wow.
and that's the core of the start of their success story. And they started from this failing appliance company that made a couple appliances to the largest in the world, and it started with that story, and that story today is part of their, culture and success.
Yeah, it becomes sort of a myth and a legend, isn't it?
Yeah,
As the company grows and probably every employee, a new employee probably hears about it, word of mouth.
but it's a true story, and it reflects that CEO that turned it around. It
Mm.
reflects the company values and culture.
I hear a few things, David. One is the how and the what are both important. So like what you say is super important, obviously, but how you deliver the message, how you deliver the story, it's also really important. So look for ways that you can stand out. Are there things that any founder or business owner should look for? Are there gems in which they should open their eyes to, or are they manufacturing a story out of, thin air?
A story doesn't necessarily have to be true. You go to movies, and a lot of those stories aren't true. I mean, they could never happen. You don't think in your mind, "Oh, that's phony baloney." I mean, there's no such thing as robots that fly. I mean, you lack or you fail to get the belief that this is phony and contrived. It just doesn't enter your mind because if robots would fly, that's how they would fly. More important is that to realize the power of stories to to break through this era of skepticism. The problem I found as I've tried to promote the idea of developing stories with companies and nonprofits especially because they usually have stories to tell. The problem is finding the right story and when you find it, to not let it slip through your grasp, to grab it and process it. And the second thing is the processing. Most of these companies, particularly nonprofits, but most organizations in general, are not staffed and they're not set up to do that. They're not
Mhm.
set up to process a story, to turn it into something that's crisp and clean in writing, or it's a colorful video. They're not processed to get that video or that print piece to the target audience.
Mhm.
That's not something that they were hired for. The other problem with storytelling is, and this happens with B2B companies a lot, B2B companies have no shortage of stories. My consulting company, Profit, we have 100 stories. And we have a case study for every conceivable industry and situation, but they're all dumbed down. They're all down to one page. They don't talk about the excitement, the tension, the breakthrough that had to occur for that story to emerge because maybe they fear the client would be sensitive. They didn't want you to know that they were in such shitty shape. Uh, or they didn't know that you were brilliant and had a solution. They didn't want their competitors to learn about it. And usually that fear is misplaced.
That's a shame, isn't it, David? I mean, I feel like for any story to grab you, there has to be this transformation, from good to bad, bad to good, whatever. There has to be this change. And if it's a case study, it has to start from a place of they're not doing very well, and then through some sort of work, transform to doing very well, right? So without that, you don't have
And
that
you know,
conflict.
all
You don't
these
have the
stories, all
transformation.
these terrific, terrific stories,
Yeah,
they have a person behind it or a set of people, a
right.
team that's really, it would be nice if you could get to know them.
The characters.
They'll have some points of tension, some things where they had breakthroughs and they had
Right.
barriers, and that's what makes the story exciting. You go to any movie or read any novel, that's what
Yeah.
makes it exciting.
Yeah. So what can we do about it? How can we help companies look at stories as legit vehicles and maybe be more willing to tell them more often?
I think it's a matter of accessing talent,
Mm,
and I think some larger companies now are hiring newspaper people or editors, reporters that know how to do that. Even hire people that are just good writers and storytellers.
right.
But if you can't hire, you can access. I think you need to hire or adopt the right people.
Yeah. Well, imagine, David, if every company or CMO has a script writer from Hollywood that's helping them gather these stories and write these amazing scripts. I mean, that would be something.
Another thing that I advocate is once you do break through, is you gotta leave them with some kind of a cognitive anchor, and we talked a little bit about taglines and Minnesota Nice and so on,
Mm,
but if you have things like that or symbols like the Sydney Opera House or something that can, really, provide in your mind some way to store and remember the major points that you're trying to make. The final thing that I tell people is go back to some fundamentals of branding and communication and marketing. And I'm thinking of things like sponsorships, for example. Think of the FedEx sponsorship of the professional golf program. Um, Over Uniqlo is got golf legends as a sponsor. They brought on in about 12 years ago the foremost world golfer that emerged out of Japan for the first time, and then they no, not golfer, a tennis player in the case of Uniqlo, and then they
Mm,
hired Roger Federer, and uh, and so, think about sponsorships and see how, like, Roger Federer tells the story of high performance, attention to detail, willingness to, work hard, and the ability to deliver performance at a high level, and that's what Uniqlo was trying to communicate. So, that's a way of doing that, and nobody looks at Roger Federer and, uh, and counter argues or is skeptical. Another thing is events. Um, Schneider Electric, the company that makes, um, sort of devices that control temperature and therefore save you energy. They have a contest every year that's been going on for 6 or 7 years where they invite people to, or firms using their product, how have you saved energy? And, last year, they got 240 entrants all over the world. They had 7 winners, and they brought them to New York, and they have a lot of publicity and visibility, not among the general public so much as, among the companies that buy and use their products. And everybody learned about applications they didn't otherwise know about, and the people that participated, you can imagine what their relationship with Schneider Electric was after that experience. And so the point is that's building a brand with without spending uh, hardly anything on advertising, and in fact, hardly spending very little in the whole thing is, as communication budgets go. And
yeah.
so having an event like that is another thing. A third thing is brand communities. And it used to be we had Harley Davidson and nobody else in terms of thinking about communities, but now
Mhm.
a lot of brands are discovering that they can support a brand community. Like Salesforce has a community of users that share ideas, share problems, share solutions, and sort of gain a sense of belonging and getting social benefits, self-expressive benefits out of being in that community. So don't just think of advertising. And for God's sakes, don't think you're in the old days where if you want to tell people these 4 bullet points, you just tell them. That doesn't work.
It's so true. It's so true. I mean, there are even brands that are born out of community where that was their first go-to, which is, I think a lot of sort of, I think there's like a running brand. I gotta find it and put it in the show notes. But a running brand that basically started as a local community run club. And then that became such a success that it grew, to other places and that became a brand on its own. But I think what is really interesting, David, is I don't know if a lot of people when they hear the word brand understand that there are all these different facets that can help you, build a brand. And the thing is, you need all these different things, whether it's symbols, whether it's, taglines, whether it's stories. It's not a one and done thing. Do you feel like over the decades of work, in this world, David, like people get it or do they not get it still?
Well, one of the reasons I added a fifth B, 1B is brand equity, and then there's brand relevance, brand image, and brand loyalty. But the fifth B is brand portfolio. Because what
Mm,
I find in going into organizations is the most common branding error is under-branding. And, I ask people, for example, what is your secret sauce? What are your employees really proud of? What
mm.
do you do special that others don't do? What's really differentiating? And then they can give me a 3 or 4 minute, very articulate, very passionate description of what that is. And then I ask, "Why don't you brand it?" Or if it's branded, why don't you elevate that brand and resource it and leverage it? And,
And David, when you say brand it, what do you mean? Give the listeners like exact what do you mean by why don't you brand it? What do you want them to do?
Put a label on it. Give it a cognitive anchor.
So David just shared that the most common mistake is under branding. What does he mean? He means if you don't put a label on something, if you don't make it easy for people to remember and to talk about it with other people, it's not a thing. So I always tell my clients, if you don't make it a thing, it doesn't become one. So how do you think about this? If in your business you develop a methodology or a technology, make sure to make it a thing. So call it, name it, put a story behind it, and communicate about it. So things like Nike Air, right? The technology of air, super important to Nike's brand. What about Tesla's autopilot or even Apple's liquid retina technology? And even today's world in AI, you have Gemini, Copilot. I mean, you have brands that are introduced, but it's important to the continuity of the company and it's something that grows over time. So make sure you don't lose that opportunity to go brand something. All right, now back to David. He's going to share some fantastic examples from Uniqlo to help us understand the power of brand.
Going back to Uniqlo, they have developed an enormous team of brands. This is kind of before they went global. They still were 400 or 500 stores in Japan, but in 1998, the fleece market was really the popular thing. Everybody's getting these puffy jackets all over the world, but especially in Japan. And they were very high end, very expensive. And so Uniqlo came out and worked with a company called Toray Industries, and they came out with a different fabric that was cheaper to make. They also had, of course, the integrated, vertically integrated companies, so they can control logistics and manufacturing and everything. And they had very simple designs. They nothing fancy.
I'm a huge fan, David. I'm a huge fan.
And they came out with a product that was 20% of the price of these competitors. 1/5. Can you
Wow.
imagine? And it was really high quality. And so the sales exploded. They sold 1,000,000 copies of these, I think, the first year. In the ensuing 10 years, they sold, like, uh, hundreds of millions of units. In the ensuing 2 years, they basically took over the fleece market, and it was a growing huge market. So, and they did this with a really low price. So then they're sitting there and they're saying, "How can we, you know, the bad of this is that we're known as a low price place, the place you go for cheap stuff,
Right.
and we don't
That's the
want
association.
that's
Yeah.
we don't want to be that. So what can we do?" And the second thing, they made 3 decisions at the time. That was one of them. The other was to go global, and the third was develop new fleece-like fabrics. They made a deal in 2000. The CEO of Uniqlo and the CEO of Toray Industries decided they would be a team, and they'd put out new fabrics for the clothing industry. Uniqlo would say, "These are the customer problems," and Toray would create fabrics that would deal with them, and then the Uniqlo would get a design and put it on the shelves. Their first product was called Heat-Tech. It was thinner than the real puffy stuff, and it was very effective at retaining heat, really effective. It changed the industry, and in the next 10 years, they sold 300,000,000 of them, of items with Heat-Tech in them. It was in, like, hundreds of apparel items,
Mhm.
and it was branded. They
Right.
branded a
They
fabric.
called it something, they branded it,
They
they
branded
they
it.
had a
It was
story
called
about it.
Heat-Tech.
Right. Right.
And they subsequently branded, um, a couple of other things. One of them was called Airism,
Mhm.
which was, 10 years later, 2013, which allowed you to create thin fabrics that were cool in the summertime. They branded 3 or 4 other fabrics, but they used these fabrics to really tell a story. To tell the story that they were innovative, that they were leaders in fabrics. They were the only retailer to do that. Second thing they did was to brand their culture. And, they had these really high standards within the stores, and they were expanding stores that half the employees were new. So they branded their culture, and one of the brands was called, Zing Zen in Ka Air. And what that meant was every employee is a boss. Every
Mm,
employee is a strategist. Every employee has uh, the ability to make decisions to improve the process, the layout, the whatever, and they had the power to implement that decision. They could do it. They didn't have to get approvals all over the place. They had the power to do that. The second one was Global One, and they were on the now they have 1,700 global stores or something, and they're opening at a fast rate, but they wanted this whole organization to be one. And so they did all these things to promote people sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, working together. Uh, and actually, in 2010 to 12, they institute for the first time in Japan, I think, everybody had to speak English in company materials.
mm,
And that came out of Global One. In 2013, it still wasn't enough to tell the story because even though the global scene hadn't participated in fleece, they were seeing products that were breathtakingly cheap as opposed to Gap or as opposed to H&M. So it was still a challenge to avoid just being a cheap place to buy. So they did something remarkable. Instead of trying to reinvent Uniqlo, the retailing brand, which was, by the way, a Japanese name, and so
mhm,
you have that, uh, and which sort of signifies cheap, to some people because of their heritage, going way back to the early Toyotas, but mainly it was a low price, so they wanted to tell this larger story. They wanted to have a higher business purpose, and they just feel they couldn't do it, and they certainly have could no way could dump the Uniqlo name. That wouldn't be possible. Just
mhm.
think of the signage alone. But, so what they developed is a business brand. They called it Lifewear, and they developed this business brand with all the signage and all the messaging, and this was the umbrella that talked about the fabric brands, the culture
Mm,
brands, and the sponsorship brands. These tennis stars that were sponsors, they all came under the Lifewear umbrella, and that was a vehicle to tell the whole story, to give it energy, to give it purpose, and so forth. They developed in 1917 or 2017, they developed uh, a newsletter. They published a paper twice a year that told the story of these fabrics and the in-store experience, but also talked about art, talked about designers, it talked about tennis players, tennis tournaments, and and so there was that. And they came out with an exposition. They did 5 of them. One was in Paris, one was in London, one was in Shanghai, and 2 were in New York, one at the Museum of Modern Art. In that the 5-day thing, they talked all about the Uniqlo brand and all of the sub-brands and so on. So the point is, it takes a team of brands. You just can't do that by telling, "We're Uniqlo, and we have this new fabric that, will put in clothes for you. We have, this fabric that will cool clothes with them." Without the brand, it's hard to communicate.
That's such a wonderful case, David. It reminds me when I was working for a startup. This is it's called Osseo. Basically, they made um, orthopedic implants. They were made of this brilliant material that turns into bone over 2 years. So for them, one of the key things that we worked on is to brand the material because it was such an incredible technology that could that was as strong or even stronger than their bone, and then over time, it became your bone. So we called it biointegrative material, and we had to name it because, as what you talked about, our brains are wired to be lazy, right? So cognitive fluency is so important because we want things to be easy, quick, and fast. And if it's a little bit more difficult to understand, or talk to me in like 4 minutes of what you're trying to tell me, I'm gone. I'm lost. I'm not even going to remember that conversation. So that's so important. However, David, I want to ask you this. Is there over branding? Is there brand palooza? Have you seen companies where it's like they're going to brand everything and then it becomes a mess? Like, what happens if you go to the other end of the spectrum?
There is a problem with overbranding, and especially it's, prevalent in the high-tech industry and software industry.
Mm,
You have all these engineers that come out with a new product, they think it deserves a brand, so they give it a brand, and that's often sticks, and so you end up with, mass confusion, and, and so the people within the company don't know what brand is appropriate for a customer that calls in because it's too confusing and too much overlap. There was a software company that um, years ago now, we would be called in to straighten out their mess. And in 3 years, the same company would call back because they had created another mess. And we then had to straighten that out by combining and reducing and changing the roles of different brand names. But, what I what I find that is that by far the greater problem is underbranding.
under branding.
Also, failing to really develop these home run taglines. Tagline is a way to highlight a priority issue and how you're positioned on it.
Right. And it becomes something that's memorable, that can be retold, that can be repeated,
Yes,
easily.
yes.
Right.
And
Mm.
even some of them can be chanted at events or on picket
Absolutely.
lines or yeah.
David, I'm interested to get your take. You talked about differentiation, and I know within the branding world, there's a debate, about distinctiveness versus differentiation. Byron Sharp, professor of marketing science at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, he's known for writing these books and research around distinctiveness, and his thing is always it's all about distinctiveness, which is whatever that you put out there just needs to stand out, look different. It doesn't matter at all differentiation. What is your take on that, David?
I think there's, some truth in it. In fact,
Mm,
Andrew Ehrenberg, was a really colorful guy, and he would put a perspective on data that was hard to argue with. It was so compelling. One time I was a young professor. I was only 3 or 4 years out of graduate school, and I had done this stuff on really sophisticated probabilistic quantitative modeling of consumer behavior. He wrote me a letter and said, "Gee, want you to know that I used your material in my latest article." And I thought, "Ah, Andrew Ehrenberg, he recognized he even knows who I am, and he used my material." And his next sentence was, "That was the worst example, the worst misuse of data I've ever seen in my life." And that's I put it forth as an example of how not to do it. I mean, who Andrew Ehrenberg is the only guy on earth that would do that. But, I think that what they say has got some truth in it, but what I
mm,
think their world is mainly very mature packaged goods. That's what they're talking very mature packaged goods where there hasn't been a real disruptive innovation in 30 years. And there's all this, "My brand is better than your brand" competition, and there's nothing to say. And it
right.
reminds me of the old advertising adage, back in the day when advertising was running brands. If you have nothing to say, sing it.
Mm,
If you have nothing to say, sing it. Develop a nice tagline, and that's kinda in the same vein, right? If you have nothing to say, sing it. If you have nothing to say, have a colorful package. Have a you know, put a mascot on it or something like that, that has nothing to do with your message. So I think there's some truth in that. But most people are not dealing with a static um, environment anymore. In fact, there's another force that in our marketplace that we haven't talked about, and that is disruptive innovation. Even these mature areas, uh, when a burst of energy or growth comes, it's usually from disruptive innovation. It's Greek yogurt, it's Coke Black, or it's something that's created a whole new subcategory that has, or it's kind candy bars that have nuts in them instead of junk. So so even in these mature areas, what you look for is disruptive innovation. But if you get into the larger space, you get into hospitality, you get into software, it's always a disruptive innovation that's causing growth. And disruptive innovation, of course, is the most extreme form of differentiation. If you look back in the last century of marketing research and academic studies and learnings, there's one thing that is probably the most robust, the most reliable, the most significant finding that we've ever had. And that is the answer to the following question. If you put out a new product, what explains its success? What one characteristic will be the most important predictor of that new product's success or failure? And it's always one thing. It's how different it is, how much differentiation it has. That one variable is by far every single study, it'll always come out. That's what we know. And today, you can't find a burst of sales anywhere that didn't come along with some kind of disruptive innovation that created must-haves that made a superior use experience or decision criteria, and that didn't change what people bought. That's almost always behind it.
I also feel like if you look at the business world, from a pure your marketing and communications, and so this is what you can do. Versus if you look at brand as the face of business strategy, you do want to deliver products that are differentiated, that are disruptive, that have things that no one else has, and I think that's almost more powerful than just the packaging and how it looks.
Some people, especially in B2B and high tech world, they tend to think of disruptive innovation as being things that change the use experience, that are functionally better. But
Yeah.
it also can be changes in the brand relationship. That can also be a disruptive innovation. And so, if you can have a brand relationship that's for some reason more respected because of their
Mhm.
social program, Dove's Real Beauty or Trivent's Habitat for Humanity, if you have something that you respect more, that you feel they share their values, it doesn't have to be a functional thing. Or it can be something that share your passion in running or share your passion in sleep instead of buying mattresses or something. That can also be a disruptive innovation. That,
Right. Broader than
uh,
just the product or the thing,
yes, yes.
right? Yes.
So
Yes.
when
Yeah.
Casper came in with a mattress, they didn't talk about their mattresses. They talked about their passion for better sleep. And
Right.
so that created a whole new subcategory, a whole new kind of brand you can talk to. It didn't mean they had a technical breakthrough.
Yeah. And I think, you have to layer on distinctiveness as well. I mean, for me, it's an and, it's not an or. You should you should put forth your brand as distinctive and different and in a way that can excite and have your audience engage. Why choose one over the other?
And of course, the other thing I say about disruptive innovation that I have in my book, Owning Game Changing Subcategories, is that branding has a role to play. And you look at the big books on disruptive innovation, like the Blue Ocean book, which is a marvelous book, sold 5 million copies, and it inspired me. But the whole book has a half page on branding. They have a half page on the first mover advantage, which incidentally doesn't even exist. But that's it. And yet branding is the key to disruptive innovation. You have to position the disruption, like Salesforce did when cloud computing came out. talked about how you don't have no investment up front, ongoing upgrading, and it's safe, and it's encapsulated with a personality that's feisty, it's modern, it's contemporary, it's not old-fashioned. So, there's that, and the second thing you have to do is to become the exemplar of that brand, and you do that with a market leader, not only in sales, but in thought, IP, and so forth, and in passion, and so forth, and finally, you have to build barriers, and, not only do you have to own the positioning, you not only have to have a large customer base, but you need to, brand the innovation like Uniqlo did.
Hey, David, I have some high profile branding failures to run by you. I wanted to get your take about whether it's hype, like the media hyped it up, or is it a true blunder? Okay, let me run through some of these over the past couple years. Cracker Barrel, the rebrand of Cracker Barrel. Is that hype or is that a true blunder?
That was a really excellent piece of work that, turned a brand that was tired, it was declining sales, it was, not getting new young customers, into one that was thriving, and it was growing, and it was getting new customers, and it had a new look that was sabotaged. It was sabotaged by, politicians that have no feel for branding. They sabotaged it and made it a symbol of woke, which was crazy, and then they put that out there with all this social media hype, and you know that I don't know, amazing percentage of that hype, 40% was bots. So a lot of the energy from this came from nefarious sources, and so it was sabotage. And so, now what can you do? You just have to back off because the, uh, the sabotage worked. They're gonna do what they had to do, but it's gonna now take them 2 or 3 years to do it. It's gonna be enormously expensive to the shareholders, and it's gonna be awfully to the costly to the employees. Some employees were threatened. I mean, politicians shouldn't be involved in running companies.
Is it unforeseen, you think, David?
I really think it is. I mean, I
Mm.
can't think of how you could have predicted that. It's like a black swan.
What
Um,
about American Eagle Outfitters with the great jeans?
I don't know that story.
Oh, that one was with, Sydney Sweeney. It's same kinda deal where it got usurped, where there was this big campaign, and she was wearing American Eagle Outfitter jeans, and, the entire backlash was around, it's a racist ad. She's clearly, is he talking about, like, white supremacy, but, obviously she's talking about jeans, and there's a double entendre about, what she's wearing and her as a celebrity. So there was a big, backlash there too.
Well, again, we come back to what I said in the beginning. My advice to people that are in that situation is don't engage in arguing. If you have to straighten out untruths, do it really simply. This is a fact. This is a fact. We're going to move on because this is garbage. But you don't argue. What you do is you try to change the subject.
David, what about Jaguar?
They're giving away a huge asset by giving away the brand symbol, and they're walking away from their whole customer base. So there's that. And if they're changing their business, they might have been better off coming up with a new brand and reserving this Jaguar for a role that it can play, leveraging that customer base and that brand image that they had. What Jaguar should have done, I think, is to come up with a new automobile brand and not call it a Jaguar, and just but it could be linked to Jaguar, could have
Right.
some of the Jaguar characteristics, and
Call it the cheetah.
yeah, they call it cheetah. That's right, they could have, and then they would have been right up there in the news. They'd be the Waymar, the engine behind Waymar, and
Right, right,
here they
right,
are,
right.
kinda invisible. I mean, you didn't know that they made Jaguar, and I couldn't make
No.
the connection, but if they would have branded that like Toyota brands the hybrid Synergy Drive, and And
Mm,
oh, the people that know automobiles know that that's a Toyota thing, and that's really the point of the branded credibility source for Toyota. And Waymo could have had a branded credibility source that would have been a Jaguar. It would have been a brand that had a lot of the Jaguar elements, but it wasn't Jaguar. I mean,
right.
you couldn't put a Jaguar brand on that because it just doesn't fit. You want a
That's right.
brand,
It's too much of a gap. There's too much of a gap,
but you
right?
couldn't put a brand that's endorsed by Jaguar.
Mhm.
So you could have had a brand, the Cheetah, uh, car, and it's made by Jaguar, who
That's right.
makes brands that are really fine kind of German technology or whatever it is. You take some of the Jaguar stands for 4 or 5 things. You take the one thing that applies to this area and drag it over, but you don't drag over the whole Jaguar name. And then you take the Jaguar name and put it in the shelf if you want to, and wait till somebody comes around with a business that can really use that name.
It's so fun to talk about this too. I feel like brand architecture is one of the, underused tools for companies.
Yeah, I once wrote a book called, Brand Portfolio Strategy, and I think it's still, to this day, the only book that deals with that.
David, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, this has been so fun. I feel like we can just chat about this forever. I have a last question for you, David. If you were to be able to place a sticky note on the desk of every CMO or business owner about branding to remind them of what it is or what they could do with it, what would that sticky note say?
I would say brand your secret sauce.
Make your secret sauce not secret anymore.
Right, yes. Yeah, that's right. Don't keep it
Put it
hidden,
out into
but,
the world.
manage it, resource it, and leverage it.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the conversation. I've had a lot of fun, learned a lot always, and thank you again.
Okay, good, Howie. Thanks for having me. It's always fun. You're really good at this stuff.
Thank you.
David just showed you how to brand your secret sauce and stop leaving growth and equity on the table. So if you like that, you'll want to meet Matt Suka. He's the CEO of MindWorks, best-selling author of The Hidden Yes, and one of the world's leading experts on consumer psychology and sales psychology. In our conversation, Matt walks through one tiny tweak to a single email that drove a 167% increase in conversions. If you're watching this on YouTube, simply click right here to meet Matt. And if you're listening on a podcast, it's episode 74, and you'll also find the link in the show notes. All right, I'll see you there.